The autumn of 1894 brought with it a peculiar melancholy to the streets of London, as though the very air had thickened with secrets waiting to be unveiled. The gas lamps flickered uncertainly through the persistent fog that shrouded the city like a grey burial shroud, and it was on one such dreary evening in early October that Inspector Lestrade appeared at our door in Baker Street, his usually composed demeanour betraying an unmistakable agitation. I had been reading the evening paper, while Holmes sat hunched over his chemical apparatus, the acrid smoke from one of his experiments mingling with the familiar aroma of his pipe tobacco. The sharp rap at our door came at precisely 8:30, and Mrs. Hudson's hurried footsteps on the stairs announced the arrival of an urgent visitor. "Gentlemen," Lestrade began without preamble as he entered our sitting-room, his coat dripping with the night's moisture, "I find myself in need of your particular expertise. We have a most perplexing case that has left the Yard completely baffled." Holmes looked up from his test tubes, his keen grey eyes immediately alert with interest. "Ah, Lestrade, your timing is impeccable. I was just growing weary of analysing the chemical composition of various tobacco ashes. Pray take a seat and tell us what brings you out on such an inhospitable evening." The inspector settled himself into the chair opposite Holmes, declining my offer of brandy with a distracted wave of his hand. 3 days ago, Sir Reginald Whitmore, the noted antiquarian and collector, was found dead in his study at Whitmore House in Belgravia. The circumstances surrounding his death are most unusual. "Murder, I presume?" Holmes inquired, setting aside his apparatus and leaning back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man presented with an intriguing puzzle. "That's just it, Mr. Holmes. We cannot determine whether it was murder, suicide, or some bizarre accident. The room was locked from the inside, with no other means of entry or exit, save the door through which we broke to discover the body. Sir Reginald was found seated at his desk, apparently having collapsed while examining a rare manuscript. There were no obvious signs of violence, no weapon present, and the post-mortem examination proved inconclusive." Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin, his eyes gleaming with that familiar light that always appeared when a particularly challenging case presented itself. "And yet you suspect foul play?" "The family insists it could not have been suicide. Sir Reginald was in excellent spirits, planning a grand exhibition of his latest acquisitions for the following month. Moreover, there are other peculiarities that have left us scratching our heads." "Such as?" Lestrade reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small leather notebook. "The servants reported hearing what they described as unearthly sounds emanating from the study in the hours before Sir Reginald's body was discovered. A low humming, they said, almost musical in nature, but unlike anything they had ever heard before. When questioned separately, 3 different staff members gave remarkably consistent accounts of this strange phenomenon." I found myself leaning forward with interest. "Could it have been some form of mechanical device?" "That was our first thought, Dr. Watson, but a thorough search of the study revealed nothing that could account for such sounds. Furthermore, the manuscript Sir Reginald was examining when he died has gone missing. According to his personal secretary, it was a recently acquired piece, a medieval text of some sort, written in Latin with curious symbols and diagrams. Quite valuable, apparently." Holmes rose from his chair and began his characteristic pacing before the fireplace. "You mentioned family. Who stands to inherit Sir Reginald's considerable fortune?" "His nephew, Marcus Whitmore, a young man of 28 with expensive tastes and mounting debts. However, he was dining at his club that evening with at least a dozen witnesses. There's also Sir Reginald's ward, Miss Evelyn Blackwood, a lady of 25 whom he took under his protection after her parents died in India some years ago. She inherits a substantial sum as well, though not nearly as much as the nephew." "And where was Miss Blackwood on the evening in question?" "At home, according to the servants, though she retired early to her rooms with a headache and was not seen after 7 o'clock. The butler confirms that she requested a light supper be sent to her chamber." Holmes paused in his pacing, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You mentioned that the room was locked from the inside. Describe the study for me, its layout, windows, any architectural peculiarities." Lestrade consulted his notebook once more. "It's on the ground floor at the rear of the house, overlooking the garden. 2 tall windows face west, both secured with heavy iron latches and showing no signs of tampering. The walls are lined with bookcases from floor to ceiling, save for the space occupied by a large fireplace. Sir Reginald's desk sits in the center of the room, with various display cases containing his most prized artifacts scattered about. And the chimney? Far too narrow for a man to pass through, and besides it shows evidence of recent use. The servants had lit a fire that very afternoon to ward off the autumn chill. Holmes returned to his chair, his expression thoughtful. Most intriguing. Tell me, Lestrade, what was Sir Reginald's demeanour in the days preceding his death? Had he mentioned any concerns, received any unusual visitors, or behaved in any manner out of character? According to his household staff, he had been unusually excited about his latest acquisition, the missing manuscript I mentioned. He'd acquired it just a week prior from a dealer in rare books, one Cornelius Blackthorne, who operates from premises in Suffolk. Sir Reginald apparently paid a considerable sum for it and spent much of his time that week studying its contents. Blackthorne, the name is familiar, Holmes mused. I believe he has something of a reputation for dealing in items of questionable provenance. Has he been questioned? We attempted to locate him, but his shop has been shuttered for the past 4 days. The neighbours report that he left quite suddenly, taking several large trunks with him. We've issued a description to all ports, but thus far he has not been apprehended. I could see the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form in Holmes's mind, though the picture remained frustratingly incomplete. What of Sir Reginald's other recent acquisitions? Was the manuscript the only new item in his collection? No, Doctor. According to his catalogues, he had acquired several pieces over the past month, an Egyptian scarab, a Celtic torque, and what his notes describe as a curious brass instrument of unknown origin and purpose. All were purchased through various dealers, though the manuscript was by far the most expensive. Holmes suddenly sprang to his feet with renewed energy. Watson, fetch your coat and medical bag. Lestrade, I trust you can arrange for us to examine the scene immediately? Certainly, Mr. Holmes, though I confess I'm not certain what we might discover that has escaped the notice of Scotland Yard's finest investigators. My friend's smile held that particular quality of confidence that had so often proved justified by subsequent events. Perhaps nothing at all, my dear Lestrade, but I have found that a fresh perspective, combined with careful observation of the smallest details, can often illuminate what others have overlooked. The journey to Belgravia through the fog-shrouded streets took the better part of an hour, our hansom cab progressing slowly through the thick murk that seemed to swallow the very sounds of the city. Whitmore House, when we finally arrived, loomed before us like something from a Gothic romance, an imposing structure of dark brick and stone, its windows glowing warmly in the gaslight, but somehow conveying an impression of brooding melancholy. The butler who admitted us was a man of perhaps 60 years, dignified in bearing despite the obvious strain of recent events. Inspector Lestrade, gentlemen, he intoned with professional courtesy. I am Harrington. Sir Reginald's study remains exactly as you requested. Nothing has been disturbed since the investigation began. As we followed Harrington through the elegantly appointed corridors, I could not help but notice the exceptional quality of Sir Reginald's collection. Ancient pottery, medieval weaponry, and mysterious artifacts from distant lands adorned every available surface, each piece no doubt possessing its own fascinating history. Tell me, Harrington, Holmes inquired as we walked, how long had you been in Sir Reginald's employ? 15 years, sir. I came to the household shortly after his wife passed away. And during that time, did you ever observe anything unusual about your master's collecting habits, any particular interests or obsessions? The butler paused for a moment, considering his words carefully. Sir Reginald was passionate about his acquisitions, sir, perhaps more so than most collectors. He believed that certain objects possessed what he called historical resonance, the ability to connect their owners with the past in ways that transcended mere scholarly interest. An interesting philosophy, and did this manuscript he acquired recently fall into that category? Indeed, sir. He was quite excited about it, spending long hours in his study examining it with various magnifying instruments and reference books. He mentioned to me on several occasions that he believed it to be far more significant than he had initially realized. We had reached the door to the study, which bore a constable's seal across its frame. Lestrade produced a key and broke the seal, ushering us into what would prove to be one of the most remarkable rooms I had ever encountered. The study was indeed impressive in its scope and organization. Thousands of volumes lined the walls, while glass cases displayed an eclectic array of artifacts that seemed to represent every civilization known to archaeology. The air still held a faint, sweet odor that I could not immediately identify, something reminiscent of incense, yet not quite familiar. Sir Reginald's body had been removed, of course, but the desk remained much as it had been found. Various papers were scattered across its surface, along with several magnifying glasses and what appeared to be translation notes written in Sir Reginald's careful hand. A chair was pushed back from the desk at an angle, suggesting its occupant had risen suddenly or collapsed unexpectedly. Holmes immediately set to work, examining every inch of the room with his characteristic thoroughness. He spent several minutes studying the floor around the desk with his magnifying glass, then moved to examine the windows, the fireplace, and finally the bookshelves themselves. "Watson," he called from his position near one of the display cases, "come and tell me what you observe about this particular arrangement of objects." I joined him before a case that contained what appeared to be a collection of Middle Eastern artifacts, ornate daggers, jeweled goblets, and several pieces of metalwork whose purpose was not immediately apparent. "They appear to be quite valuable," I offered. "The craftsmanship is exceptional." "Yes, but observe more closely. Do you notice anything unusual about their positioning within the case?" I studied the display more carefully and gradually became aware of what had caught Holmes's attention. The objects were arranged in a very specific pattern, not randomly or even aesthetically, but according to some underlying principle that created an almost geometrical design. "It appears deliberate," I said slowly, "as though they've been positioned to form some sort of pattern or symbol." "Precisely. And now examine this case and this one." Holmes led me to two other display areas, each of which showed similar arrangements of artifacts. "Someone has been very carefully repositioning Sir Reginald's collection according to some predetermined design. The question is whether it was Sir Reginald himself or another party." Lestrade, who had been observing our examination with growing puzzlement, cleared his throat. "I'm afraid I don't follow, Mr. Holmes. What significance could the arrangement of these objects possibly have to Sir Reginald's death?" Holmes straightened and turned to face the inspector, his expression grave. "That, my dear Lestrade, is precisely what we must determine. But I suspect that when we understand the meaning behind these arrangements, we will be much closer to understanding what happened in this room 3 nights ago." He returned to the desk and began examining Sir Reginald's notes more closely, occasionally making small exclamations of interest. After several minutes, he looked up with an expression of intense concentration. "Watson, you mentioned the odor in this room when we entered. What would your medical expertise suggest as its likely source?" I inhaled deeply, trying to analyze the faint but persistent smell that permeated the study. "It's sweet, almost cloying, possibly organic in nature, perhaps some form of herb or plant extract. There's something about it that suggests medicinal properties, though I cannot be more specific without further analysis." "Interesting. And would you say it was stronger near any particular area of the room?" I moved about the study, testing the air in different locations. "It does seem more concentrated near the desk, and particularly around that chair where Sir Reginald was found." Holmes nodded with satisfaction. "Exactly as I suspected. Lestrade, I believe we are dealing with something far more complex than a simple locked room mystery. This case involves elements that may require us to venture into areas where conventional police work rarely treads." "What do you mean, Mr. Holmes?" "I mean that Sir Reginald Whitmore may have fallen victim to forces that he himself unleashed through his scholarly pursuits. That missing manuscript was no ordinary historical document, I would venture to say. It was something far more dangerous." Before either Lestrade or I could respond to this cryptic statement, we were interrupted by a commotion from the corridor outside the study. Harrington's voice could be heard in urgent conversation with someone whose responses were too muffled to understand clearly. Moments later, the butler appeared in the doorway, his composed demeanor showing cracks of genuine distress. "Inspector Lestrade, gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, but there has been another development. Miss Blackwood has just returned from an errand and, well, perhaps it would be best if she spoke with you directly. She claims to have information about the manuscript that Sir Reginald was studying before his death." Holmes and I exchanged glances, both recognizing the significance of this unexpected development. "By all means, show her in," Holmes replied. "It appears our investigation has taken yet another intriguing turn. Miss Evelyn Blackwood proved to be a striking young woman of perhaps 25 years, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that betrayed a depth of character uncommon in one so young. She was dressed in mourning attire, but carried herself with a dignity that spoke of inner strength despite obvious grief. "Gentlemen," she began without preamble, "Harrington tells me that you are investigating Uncle Reginald's death. I have information that may be of importance, though I confess I am uncertain whether sharing it will help or hinder your efforts." Holmes gestured for her to take a seat near the fireplace, away from the more disturbing aspects of the crime scene. "Miss Blackwood, I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. Any information you can provide would be most welcome, regardless of how unusual it may seem. She settled herself with evident relief, though her hands trembled slightly as she arranged her skirts. It concerns the manuscript that Uncle Reginald acquired recently, the one that has gone missing. I fear I may have contributed to the circumstances that led to his death, albeit unknowingly. In what way? 3 weeks ago, while Uncle Reginald was away on business, I received a visitor at the house, a gentleman who gave his name as Dr. Emanuel Voss, claiming to be a scholar of medieval texts from the University of Prague. He said he had heard of Uncle Reginald's recent acquisition and wondered if he might examine it briefly, as it related to his own research into what he termed practical applications of historical knowledge. Holmes leaned forward with interest. "And you permitted this examination?" "I'm afraid I did." Dr. Voss was most persuasive, and he presented credentials that appeared genuine. He spent perhaps 2 hours in the study with the manuscript, making notes and sketches. When he left, he expressed great enthusiasm about the document and mentioned that he hoped to discuss its implications with Uncle Reginald when he returned. "Did you inform Sir Reginald of this visit?" Miss Blackwood's expression grew troubled. "I intended to, but when Uncle Reginald returned, he was so excited about some other discovery he had made during his travels that the matter slipped my mind until it was too late." Too late? When Uncle Reginald began his intensive study of the manuscript after his return, his behavior began to change. He became increasingly secretive, spending entire days locked in his study. He would emerge at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, rearranging objects throughout the house according to patterns that seemed to make sense only to him. Watson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "What sort of patterns?" "Geometric designs primarily, though some appeared to be based on astronomical observations. He would move artifacts from room to room, positioning them with mathematical precision and becoming quite agitated if anything was disturbed. He also began burning strange substances in the fireplace, herbs and powders that produced unusual odors and sometimes colored flames." Holmes's eyes had taken on that intense quality that always accompanied his moments of greatest deductive insight. "Miss Blackwood, did Dr. Voss leave anything behind after his visit? Any papers, books, or other materials?" "Actually, yes. He left a small notebook quite by accident, I believe. I discovered it wedged between cushions in the chair where he had been sitting. I intended to return it, but he had provided no address, and Uncle Reginald's return distracted me from the matter entirely." "Do you still have this notebook?" "I do. It's in my room upstairs." She rose quickly, apparently eager to contribute something useful to the investigation. "Shall I fetch it?" "If you would be so kind." As Miss Blackwood departed to retrieve the notebook, Holmes turned to Lestrade with an expression of growing excitement. "Inspector, I believe we may be on the verge of a breakthrough. The pieces of this puzzle are beginning to arrange themselves into a pattern that, while extraordinary, may explain the seemingly impossible circumstances of Sir Reginald's death." "I confess I'm still quite in the dark, Mr. Holmes. What possible connection could there be between mysterious visitors, rearranged artifacts, and a locked-room death?" Holmes moved to one of the display cases and gestured toward the carefully arranged objects within. "Consider the evidence before us, Lestrade. A scholar of medieval texts gains access to a rare manuscript. Shortly afterward, the manuscript's owner begins engaging in ritualistic behavior, involving the precise positioning of ancient artifacts and the burning of specific substances. Finally, the owner dies under mysterious circumstances while studying the manuscript in a room that appears to be sealed from within." "Are you suggesting some form of supernatural influence?" "I am suggesting that someone has used Sir Reginald's scholarly enthusiasm to manipulate him into performing actions whose true purpose he did not fully understand. Whether those actions resulted in his death through entirely natural means or through forces beyond conventional understanding remains to be determined." Before our conversation could continue, Miss Blackwood returned carrying a small leather-bound notebook. She handed it to Holmes with obvious relief, as though glad to be rid of the burden it represented. Holmes immediately began examining the notebook's contents, his expression growing increasingly grave as he turned each page. After several minutes of intense study, he looked up with an expression that I had rarely seen, a combination of fascination and genuine concern. "Gentlemen, Miss Blackwood," he said slowly, "this notebook contains detailed instructions for what can only be described as a ritual of summoning. The medieval manuscript that Sir Reginald acquired was not merely a historical document, it was a grimoire, a book of practical magic designed to provide its user with knowledge and power through communion with entities whose nature I hesitate to speculate upon. The silence that followed this pronouncement was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of London traffic filtering through the fog. Finally, Lestrade cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mr. Holmes, surely you don't expect us to believe that Sir Reginald died as a result of black magic?" Holmes closed the notebook and fixed the inspector with a steady gaze. "What I believe, Lestrade, is that someone used Sir Reginald's own knowledge and enthusiasm to convince him to perform a series of actions that resulted in his death. Whether that death was caused by supernatural forces, by some form of poison or drug administered through the ritual substances he was burning, or by some other means entirely, I cannot yet say. But I am convinced that this Dr. Voss, whoever he may be, orchestrated the entire sequence of events for his own purposes." Miss Blackwood had grown quite pale during this exchange. "You're saying that this man tricked Uncle Reginald into killing himself?" "I'm saying that your uncle became the victim of an elaborate and calculating scheme. The question now is whether Dr. Voss achieved his goal through entirely mundane means, or whether we are dealing with something that transcends the boundaries of conventional criminality." Holmes moved to the window and gazed out into the fog-shrouded garden, his profile sharp against the gaslight. "There is one way to determine the truth of the matter. We must locate Dr. Emmanuel Voss and discover the true purpose behind his elaborate charade. I suspect that when we do, we will uncover a conspiracy that extends far beyond the death of one antiquarian collector." He turned back to face us, his expression resolute. "Watson, we must return to Baker Street immediately. There are inquiries to be made and preparations to be undertaken. I fear that Sir Reginald's death may be only the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous game." As we prepared to leave Whitmore House, I could not shake the feeling that we were departing from more than just a crime scene. The very atmosphere of the study seemed charged with an energy that had nothing to do with gaslight or coal fire, something that lingered like an echo of whatever forces had been unleashed within those walls 3 nights before. The fog had thickened during our time in the house, transforming the familiar streets of London into an alien landscape of shadows and uncertain shapes. As our hansom cab made its slow progress through the murk, Holmes sat in contemplative silence, the notebook clutched tightly in his hands. "Holmes," I finally ventured, "do you truly believe that we are dealing with supernatural forces?" My friend was quiet for so long that I began to wonder if he had heard my question. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible above the clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestone. "Watson, in my career I have encountered criminals of every description, murderers and thieves, blackmailers and forgers, madmen and geniuses, but I have never before encountered a case where the boundary between the possible and the impossible seemed so deliberately blurred. Whether Dr. Voss wielded supernatural powers or merely exploited Sir Reginald's belief in such powers, the result remains the same. A man is dead, and his killer has vanished into the shadows of London." He leaned forward suddenly, his eyes reflecting the intermittent flashes of streetlight. "But mark my words, my dear fellow, whatever forces we may be confronting, they have made one crucial error. They have drawn the attention of Sherlock Holmes, and I do not intend to rest until this mystery is resolved, regardless of how dark the path to truth may prove to be." As we finally reached Baker Street and climbed the familiar stairs to our rooms, I found myself wondering what revelations the coming investigation would bring. The notebook that Holmes carried seemed to pulse with malevolent purpose, and I could not dismiss the feeling that by taking possession of it, we had somehow made ourselves participants in a game whose rules we did not yet understand. The night was far from over, and I sensed that before dawn broke over London, we would find ourselves confronting mysteries that would test not only our powers of deduction, but our very understanding of what was possible in this rational world we thought we knew so well. The morning light filtering through our Baker Street windows did little to dispel the sense of unease that had settled upon me during the night. I had slept fitfully, my dreams haunted by images of shadowy figures manipulating ancient artifacts in candlelit chambers, while strange humming sounds echoed through corridors that seemed to stretch into infinity. Holmes, as was his custom, when a particularly challenging case consumed his attention, had apparently not slept at all. I found him in the sitting room, still fully dressed, surrounded by books on medieval history, demonology, and various arcane subjects that I had never previously known him to study. "Ah, Watson," he greeted me, without looking up from the volume he was examining. I trust you slept better than your restless movements throughout the night would suggest. Hardly at all, I'm afraid. Have you made any progress with that confounded notebook? Holmes set aside his book and picked up the leather journal that Dr. Voss had left behind. Indeed I have, though I confess that each revelation only deepens the mystery rather than clarifying it. Dr. Emmanuel Voss, if that is indeed his real name, is no ordinary scholar. This notebook contains detailed plans for what can only be described as a systematic campaign of manipulation, with Sir Reginald Whitmore as merely the first target in a much larger scheme. I poured myself coffee from the pot Mrs. Hudson had left for us and settled into my chair, prepared for one of Holmes's characteristically thorough explanations. According to these notes, Holmes continued, Voss has identified several collectors throughout Europe who possess rare manuscripts or artifacts that he considers essential to his ultimate purpose. Sir Reginald was selected not only because he had recently acquired the particular grimoire that Voss required, but because his psychological profile made him an ideal subject for the kind of elaborate deception that Voss specializes in. Psychological profile. Voss has made detailed observations about Sir Reginald's personality, his scholarly methods, his superstitions, and his emotional vulnerabilities. The man was studied like a specimen in a laboratory before Voss ever made contact with Miss Blackwood. Every aspect of the subsequent manipulation was planned with surgical precision. Holmes rose and began his familiar pacing before the fireplace. But here is where the matter becomes truly disturbing, Watson. The ritual that Sir Reginald was led to perform was not merely elaborate theatre designed to frighten him to death or provide cover for some conventional form of murder. According to these notes, Voss genuinely believed that the ceremony would produce tangible results, that by combining the specific artifacts Sir Reginald possessed with the incantations contained in the manuscript, something would be summoned. Summoned? Voss refers to it as opening a gateway and establishing communication with the guardians of ancient knowledge. Whether he is a brilliant charlatan exploiting others' superstitions for material gain or a genuine practitioner of dark arts, I cannot yet determine, but I am convinced that his ultimate goal extends far beyond the death of Sir Reginald Whitmore. As if summoned by Holmes's words, Mrs. Hudson appeared at our door with the Morning Post. Among the usual correspondence was a telegram that Holmes opened with obvious anticipation. From my inquiries at the University of Prague, he explained after scanning the contents, there is no record of any Dr. Emmanuel Voss on their faculty, nor has anyone matching his description ever been associated with their medieval studies department. However, they do have records of a Dr. Victor Zemeckis, a former professor who was dismissed 3 years ago for conducting unauthorized experiments involving what they diplomatically term unorthodox research methods. Do you believe this Zemeckis and our Dr. Voss are the same person? I would stake my reputation on it. The telegram goes on to describe Zemeckis as a brilliant but unstable scholar who became obsessed with proving that medieval magical practices contained genuine scientific principles that had been suppressed by conventional academics. His dismissal followed allegations that he had been using university resources to acquire dangerous artifacts and had been conducting rituals in the basement laboratories. Holmes moved to our window and gazed down at the bustling street below, his expression thoughtful. After his dismissal, Zemeckis disappeared entirely, taking with him several rare manuscripts from the university library. The authorities issued warrants for his arrest, but he vanished without a trace, until he surfaced in London as Dr. Voss. Precisely. And if my understanding of his notes is correct, his visit to Sir Reginald was merely the first step in a plan to acquire a collection of specific artifacts and manuscripts scattered across Europe. He believes that by combining these items according to ancient formulae, he can achieve something that he refers to as the Great Working, though what exactly that entails remains frustratingly unclear. Our discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Lestrade, whose haggard appearance suggested that he too had spent a sleepless night wrestling with the implications of our discoveries at Whitmore House. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began without preamble, "there have been developments in the Whitmore case that I fear will complicate matters considerably. Pray continue. We've received word from the Paris police that a collector named Henri Dubois was found dead in his apartment yesterday morning under circumstances remarkably similar to those surrounding Sir Reginald's death. He was discovered in his private study, seated at his desk with no obvious cause of death and no signs of struggle. The room was locked from within, and neighbors reported strange humming sounds emanating from the apartment during the night. Holmes straightened with obvious interest. And I suppose Monsieur Dubois was also a collector of rare manuscripts and artifacts. Indeed he was. According to the French authorities, he had recently acquired what they describe as a medieval treatise on alchemical practices from a dealer whose description matches that of our missing Cornelius Blackthorne. The manuscript has vanished, along with several valuable artifacts that Dubois had been studying. The pattern becomes clearer, Holmes mused. Zemeckis, operating under various aliases, has been systematically targeting collectors who possess items essential to his larger plan. He arranges for them to acquire specific manuscripts, then manipulates them into performing rituals that result in their deaths, leaving him free to claim both the manuscripts and any associated artifacts. Lestrade settled himself into a chair, his expression troubled. But how does he manage to kill them? Both deaths occurred in locked rooms with no apparent means of entry or exit. That, my dear Lestrade, is the question that lies at the heart of this entire mystery. Either Zemeckis has discovered methods of murder that leave no conventional traces, or, Holmes paused, his expression grave, or we are dealing with forces that operate beyond the boundaries of normal criminal activity. Before the inspector could respond, we were interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps on our stairs. Mrs. Hudson appeared moments later, clearly flustered. "Mr. Holmes, there's a young lady to see you. Says it's urgent and concerns the Whitmore case. She seems quite distressed. Show her up immediately." The woman who entered our sitting room was perhaps 30 years of age, elegantly dressed, but with an air of barely controlled panic about her. Her dark hair was disheveled, and her hands trembled as she clutched a small leather satchel. "Mr. Holmes, I am Lady Margaret Ashford. I've come to you because I fear I may be in terrible danger, and Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard suggested that you might be able to help me." Holmes gestured for her to take a seat near the fireplace, while I poured her a cup of tea to help calm her nerves. "Lady Ashford, please tell us what has brought you to our door in such evident distress." She accepted the tea gratefully, though her hands continued to shake as she raised the cup to her lips. "It concerns my late husband's collection of antiquities. Lord Ashford died 6 months ago, leaving me his entire estate, including what experts consider to be one of the finest private collections of medieval manuscripts in England. Yesterday, I received a visitor, a scholar who claimed to be researching the historical significance of certain rare texts." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with Lestrade. "Can you describe this visitor?" "A gentleman of perhaps 40 years, well-dressed and possessed of considerable charm and erudition. He gave his name as Dr. Mortimer Blackwood and presented credentials from the Royal Archaeological Society. He was particularly interested in a manuscript that my husband had acquired shortly before his death, a Byzantine text dealing with what he called practical applications of ancient wisdom." "And you permitted him to examine this manuscript?" "I saw no harm in it. Dr. Blackwood was most persuasive, and his credentials appeared genuine. He spent several hours in my husband's study, making detailed notes and sketches. When he departed, he expressed great enthusiasm about the document and suggested that it might be far more significant than anyone had previously realized." Holmes leaned forward intently. "Lady Ashford, when exactly did this visit occur?" 2 days ago. "But last night, I began to have second thoughts about the wisdom of allowing a stranger such free access to my husband's collection. I decided to examine the manuscript myself to see what had so excited Dr. Blackwood's interest." She reached into her satchel and withdrew a leather-bound volume that immediately commanded our attention. Even at a distance, I could see that it was an ancient text, its pages yellowed with age and covered in elaborate illustrations that seemed to depict various ritual practices. "What I discovered alarmed me greatly," Lady Ashford continued. "The manuscript contains detailed instructions for what can only be described as summoning ceremonies, methods for contacting entities that the text refers to as the ancient guardians of hidden knowledge. Moreover, someone had inserted additional pages into the volume, modern notes written in English that provided translations and commentary on the original Byzantine text." Holmes accepted the manuscript and began examining it with his magnifying glass, his expression growing increasingly troubled as he studied its contents. "These modern editions," he observed after several minutes, "are in the same handwriting as the notes in Dr. Voss's notebook. Lady Ashford, you have not merely received a visit from an interested scholar, you have been targeted by the same individual who orchestrated the death of Sir Reginald Whitmore." The colour drained from Lady Ashford's face. "Death? But surely you don't mean to suggest— I mean to suggest that you are in immediate and grave danger, Holmes replied firmly. The pattern is unmistakable. This individual, operating under various aliases, has been systematically targeting collectors of rare manuscripts and artifacts. He arranges for them to acquire specific texts, then manipulates them into performing rituals that result in their deaths, leaving him free to claim the items he seeks. Lady Ashford's teacup rattled against its saucer as her hands began to shake more violently. But what possible purpose could my death serve? The manuscript is already in my possession. Surely he could simply steal it if that was his goal. The manuscript alone is not his objective, Holmes explained patiently. According to the evidence we have gathered, he requires not only the texts themselves, but also specific artifacts that must be arranged and utilized in conjunction with the rituals described in the manuscripts. Your husband's collection undoubtedly contains items that are essential to his larger plan. Lestrade cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mr. Holmes, with all due respect, are we seriously discussing the possibility that these deaths are the result of actual supernatural activity? Holmes set the manuscript aside and fixed the inspector with a penetrating stare. What I am discussing, Lestrade, is a systematic campaign of murder disguised as a cult ritual. Whether our killer achieves his results through supernatural means or through entirely mundane methods of poisoning and misdirection matters less than stopping him before he claims another victim. He turned back to Lady Ashford with renewed urgency. You must tell us everything about this Dr. Blackwood's visit. What specific artifacts did he examine? What questions did he ask? Did he leave anything behind or request that you perform any particular actions? Lady Ashford composed herself with visible effort. He was particularly interested in 3 items from my husband's collection: an ornate silver chalice of Byzantine origin, a ceremonial dagger with strange symbols carved into its blade, and what he described as a focusing crystal that my husband had acquired from a dealer in Prague. He spent considerable time examining each piece, making detailed sketches and measurements. And did he suggest any particular way that these items should be displayed or arranged? As a matter of fact, yes. He mentioned that medieval practitioners believed certain geometric arrangements could enhance the spiritual resonance of ritual objects. He even went so far as to suggest a specific pattern for displaying the 3 artifacts in my husband's study, claiming it would better preserve their historical significance. Holmes's expression had grown increasingly grave during this recitation. Lady Ashford, did you follow his suggestions regarding the arrangement of these items? I did, yes. It seemed harmless enough, and Dr. Blackwood was most persuasive in his arguments about proper preservation methods. And have you spent any significant time in your husband's study since rearranging the artifacts? I was there for several hours yesterday evening, reading through some of my husband's notes about the manuscript. I must admit, I found the atmosphere somewhat oppressive. There was a strange odor in the air, sweet and cloying, and I began to feel quite unwell. I attributed it to emotional distress over my husband's death, but now I wonder. Holmes sprang to his feet with sudden energy. Watson, gather your medical supplies immediately. Lady Ashford, you must not return to your home under any circumstances. The trap has already been set, and it was only your fortuitous decision to seek help that prevented you from falling victim to the same fate as Sir Reginald and Monsieur Dubois. But I don't understand, Lady Ashford protested. How could the mere arrangement of artifacts pose any danger? Because, Holmes replied grimly, the focusing crystal that you mentioned is not merely a decorative artifact. Based on my research into similar cases, I believe it to be a sophisticated device for the dispersal of toxic substances. When positioned correctly in conjunction with the other artifacts and activated by specific incantations or chemical processes, it releases vapors that can induce hallucinations, respiratory distress, and eventually death. I had been listening to this explanation with growing horror, my medical training allowing me to appreciate the diabolical ingenuity of such a method. How you're suggesting that our killer has been using the victim's own scholarly enthusiasm to convince them to create elaborate death traps in their own studies. Precisely, Watson. The victims believe they are participating in scholarly research or, in Sir Reginald's case, actual magical practices. In reality, they are assembling the components of their own murder weapons. The locked room mystery is no mystery at all. The victims die alone, poisoned by devices that they themselves activated. Lestrade shook his head in amazement. But the complexity of such a scheme, The knowledge required to design such devices, surely we're dealing with someone of exceptional intelligence and scientific training. Indeed we are. Dr. Victor Zemeckis was dismissed from the University of Prague for conducting unauthorized chemical experiments. I suspect that his research into medieval alchemy led him to discover methods for creating sophisticated toxins using traditional alchemical equipment and ingredients. By disguising his murder weapons as historical artifacts, he can introduce them into private collections without arousing suspicion. Holmes moved to our window and gazed out at the busy London street. But there is still one crucial element of this puzzle that eludes me. Zemeckis is clearly collecting these manuscripts and artifacts for a specific purpose, something he refers to as the Great Working. Until we understand his ultimate objective, we cannot predict his next move or prevent future murders. Lady Ashford had been following this exchange with obvious terror. "Mr. Holmes, what am I to do? If my home has been turned into a death trap, where can I go? And what of my husband's collection? Surely it cannot simply be abandoned." "You will remain here under our protection until this matter is resolved," Holmes replied decisively. "As for your husband's collection, it must be examined by experts who can identify which items are genuine artifacts and which are Zemeckis's murderous devices. Watson, I want you to accompany Lady Ashford to her home, but under no circumstances are either of you to enter the study. We must engage the services of a qualified chemist who can analyze the atmosphere in that room safely." Before I could respond, we were once again interrupted by Mrs. Hudson, who appeared at our door with an expression of considerable concern. "Mr. Holmes, there's a gentleman downstairs who insists on speaking with you immediately. He says it concerns a matter of life and death, and he mentioned the Whitmore case specifically." Holmes exchanged glances with Lestrade and myself. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson." The man who entered our sitting room was tall and distinguished-looking, with greying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He wore the robes of an academic, and his manner suggested both urgency and scholarly precision. "Mr. Holmes, I am Professor Archibald Thornton from the British Museum. I have come to warn you that you and your colleagues may be in considerable danger." Holmes gestured for the professor to join our growing assembly around the fireplace. "Professor Thornton, pray explain the nature of this danger." "It concerns Dr. Victor Zemeckis, also known by several aliases, including Dr. Emmanuel Voss and Dr. Mortimer Blackwood. The British Museum has been tracking his activities for the past 2 years, ever since several rare manuscripts disappeared from our collection under suspicious circumstances." "You know of Zemeckis?" "Indeed we do. He is a former colleague of mine, brilliant but utterly ruthless. His dismissal from Prague was the result of experiments that killed several laboratory animals and endangered the lives of graduate students. Since then, he has been systematically acquiring rare manuscripts and artifacts from private collections across Europe, always through elaborate deceptions and often leaving death in his wake." Professor Thornton reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder of documents. "We have been attempting to track his movements and prevent further deaths, but he is extraordinarily clever and always stays one step ahead of the authorities. However, we have recently decoded portions of his research notes, and what we discovered is deeply troubling." Holmes accepted the folder and began examining its contents with obvious interest. "What have you learned about his ultimate objectives?" "Zemeckis believes that medieval alchemists and magicians possess genuine knowledge of natural forces that modern science has forgotten or deliberately suppressed. He has spent years collecting manuscripts and artifacts that he believes will allow him to demonstrate the reality of what he calls practical magic, the ability to manipulate physical reality through ritual practices combined with advanced chemistry." "And his great working?" Professor Thornton's expression grew grave. "According to our analysis of his notes, Zemeckis plans to conduct a massive ritual at the convergence of several astronomical phenomena that will occur in just 3 days' time. He believes that by combining specific manuscripts, artifacts, and chemical processes at precisely the right moment, he can open what he describes as a permanent gateway to the source of all ancient wisdom." Which, translated into practical terms, means what exactly? "We believe he intends to release some form of chemical agent into London's atmosphere, possibly a hallucinogenic compound that would affect thousands of people simultaneously. Whether he genuinely believes this will produce supernatural results, or whether he simply wants to create mass chaos for his own purposes, we cannot determine. But the potential for catastrophe is enormous." The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Finally Holmes spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 days. Professor Thornton, do you know where Zemeckis plans to conduct this ritual? We believe he has established a base of operations somewhere in the London Underground. The old Roman catacombs beneath the city provide numerous locations that would be ideal for his purposes. He has been importing chemical equipment and rare ingredients through various shell companies, always paying in cash and using false identities. Holmes rose and began his characteristic pacing with renewed intensity. Then we have no time to lose. Lestrade, I need Scotland Yard to begin searching every abandoned building, underground chamber, and disused tunnel within a 10-mile radius of central London. Professor Thornton, I require detailed maps of the Roman catacombs and any other subterranean structures that might serve Zemeckis' purposes. And Lady Ashford? I inquired. She will accompany us. Her husband's collection may contain additional clues to Zemeckis' plans, and she may be able to identify items that he examined during his visit. Moreover, she is safer with us than anywhere else. Zemeckis is unlikely to abandon his larger scheme to pursue one individual target when he is so close to achieving his ultimate goal. As our impromptu council of war began to organize itself for the hunt ahead, I found myself reflecting on the strange turn that our investigation had taken. What had begun as a simple locked-room mystery had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous, a race against time to prevent a madman from unleashing chaos upon the greatest city in the world. Holmes paused in his planning to address us all with characteristic intensity. Gentlemen, Lady Ashford, we are about to embark upon what may prove to be the most dangerous investigation of my career. We face an adversary who combines brilliant intellect with complete moral emptiness, who has killed at least 3 people in pursuit of his goals, and who now threatens thousands more. But I give you my word that we will stop him, regardless of what forces, natural or supernatural, he may seek to employ against us. As the afternoon light began to fade outside our windows, casting long shadows across Baker Street, I could not help but feel that we were preparing for a battle that would test not only our detective skills, but our very understanding of what was possible in this rational world we thought we knew. The fog was beginning to gather once again, and somewhere in the labyrinthine depths beneath London, a madman was preparing to unleash horrors that would make his previous crimes seem like mere rehearsals for the main event. The game, as Holmes might say, was afoot, but this time the stakes were higher than any we had faced before, and the rules of engagement were unlike anything in our previous experience. As we gathered our resources for the hunt that lay ahead, I found myself wondering whether our combined efforts would prove sufficient to stop Dr. Victor Zemeckis before he could complete his great working and transform London into a stage for his twisted vision of practical magic. The clock on our mantelpiece chimed the hour, its sound somehow ominous in the gathering darkness. 3 days until the astronomical convergence that Zemeckis required for his ritual. 3 days to locate a brilliantly clever killer in a city of millions. 3 days to prevent a catastrophe whose dimensions we could barely imagine. As Holmes began issuing detailed instructions to Lestrade and Professor Thornton, I caught Lady Ashford's eye and saw there a reflection of my own apprehension. We had entered territory where detection and deduction might not be enough, where the very nature of reality itself seemed to be at stake. But if anyone could navigate such treacherous waters and emerge victorious, it was Sherlock Holmes, and I was determined to stand beside him regardless of what darkness we might encounter in the depths beneath London. The following morning brought with it an unseasonable chill that seemed to penetrate the very stones of London, as though the city itself sensed the approaching climax of Dr. Victor Zemeckis' deadly scheme. Holmes had spent the night in intense preparation, coordinating with Professor Thornton to analyze ancient maps of London's underground chambers, while Lestrade organized search teams from Scotland Yard. Lady Ashford, despite her obvious terror, had proven invaluable in identifying additional artifacts from her husband's collection that matched descriptions in Zemeckis' notebook. I was examining the latest batch of evidence when Holmes burst into our sitting room with the triumphant expression that always accompanied a significant breakthrough. "Watson, I believe I have located our quarry. The astronomical convergence that Zemeckis requires occurs at precisely midnight tonight, when the moon reaches its zenith while Jupiter and Saturn align in a configuration that has not been seen for over 3 centuries. More importantly, the geometric calculations in his notes indicate that he requires a location with specific underground chambers oriented according to ancient Roman surveying principles." Holmes spread a detailed map across our table, pointing to a series of interconnected tunnels beneath the Southwark district. There are only 3 locations in London that meet his requirements, and 2 of them have been thoroughly searched by Lestrade's men. The third, however, is a complex of chambers beneath the ruins of an ancient Roman temple, long forgotten and accessible only through a concealed entrance in the basement of Cornelius Blackthorne's bookshop. Blackthorne, the dealer who sold Sir Reginald the original manuscript. Indeed, I suspect that Blackthorne has been Zemeckis's agent in London, responsible for placing specific manuscripts with targeted collectors and establishing the base of operations for the Great Working. His sudden departure from London was not an attempt to flee justice, but rather a strategic withdrawal to allow Zemeckis to utilize the chambers beneath his shop without interruption. Lestrade arrived as Holmes was explaining his deductions, accompanied by a squad of armed constables and several members of the Metropolitan Fire Brigade, equipped with breathing apparatus. "Mr. Holmes," the inspector began without preamble, "my men have confirmed that the Blackthorne shop has been abandoned for over a week, but there are signs of recent activity in the basement. We've also detected strange odors emanating from beneath the building, chemical smells that our experts believe may be toxic. Then we have found our target. Professor Thornton, have you brought the neutralizing agents we discussed?" The academic nodded grimly, indicating several wooden crates that his assistants were carrying. "These contain chemical compounds that should counteract most known toxic vapors, based on our analysis of Zemeckis's research notes. However, I must warn you that we cannot predict what other surprises he may have prepared for uninvited guests." Holmes checked his pocket watch with obvious urgency. "Gentlemen, it is now 4 o'clock in the afternoon. If Zemeckis intends to begin his ritual at midnight, he will likely commence preparations within the next few hours. We must act immediately before he can release whatever chemical agents he has prepared." As we made our final preparations for the descent into Zemeckis's underground lair, Lady Ashford surprised us all by insisting that she accompany the expedition. "Mr. Holmes," she declared with quiet determination, "this madman killed my husband and would have killed me as well. I have as much right as anyone to see him brought to justice. Lady Ashford, the dangers we may encounter are no greater than what I have already faced. Moreover, I am the only person here who has seen Zemeckis face to face in recent weeks. If we encounter him in the darkness below, you will need someone who can positively identify him." Holmes considered her argument for a moment, then nodded approvingly. "Very well, but you will remain with Watson at all times and follow his instructions without question. The underground chambers may contain not only chemical hazards, but also mechanical traps designed to prevent interference with Zemeckis's work." The approach to Blackthorne's shop required careful coordination with Lestrade's men, who had cordoned off the surrounding streets to prevent civilian casualties in case of chemical release. The building itself stood dark and apparently empty, its windows boarded and its door secured with official seals. However, Holmes quickly located a concealed entrance through an adjacent alleyway that led directly to the basement. The descent into the depths beneath London was unlike anything in my previous experience with Holmes's cases. The basement of Blackthorne's shop opened onto a narrow stone staircase that descended into the Roman-era chambers, its walls slick with moisture and glowing with an eerie phosphorescence that suggested the presence of chemical agents. "Breathing apparatus for everyone," Holmes ordered, as we prepared to enter the deeper tunnels. "Professor Thornton, I want continuous monitoring of the air quality. At the first sign of dangerous concentrations, we retreat immediately." The tunnels themselves were a maze of interconnected chambers carved from the living rock, their walls decorated with ancient Roman inscriptions, and later medieval additions that spoke of their use by various clandestine groups throughout London's history. But it was the modern additions that commanded our attention, electrical cables snaking along the ceiling, providing illumination to chambers that had been dark for centuries, and the overwhelming smell of chemical compounds that grew stronger as we penetrated deeper into the complex. "Holmes," I whispered as we paused at a junction of 3 tunnels, "do you hear that?" From somewhere ahead came the sound that had so disturbed the servants at Whitmore House, a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to vibrate through the stone itself. But now, hearing it in its place of origin, I could identify it as mechanical rather than supernatural, the sound of electrical generators and chemical processing equipment operating at maximum capacity. Holmes signaled for absolute silence as we crept toward the source of the humming. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber that had been transformed into something resembling a mad scientist's laboratory crossed with a medieval temple. Electrical equipment lined the walls, connected to bubbling chemical apparatus that filled the air with colored vapors. At the center of the chamber stood an elaborate altar composed of the artifacts that Zemeckis had stolen from his victims: Sir Reginald's focusing crystal, Lady Ashford's ceremonial dagger, and dozens of other objects arranged in precise geometric patterns. And there, standing before the altar with his back to us, was the man we had been hunting, Dr. Victor Zemeckis, no longer disguised as the charming scholar who had deceived his victims. He was tall and lean, dressed in robes that combined academic formality with ritualistic symbolism, his graying hair wild from hours of intense work. Before him lay the missing manuscripts, open to specific pages and held in place by weighted clamps. "You are punctual, Mr. Holmes," Zemeckis said without turning around, his voice carrying a thick Central European accent. "I had wondered when you would locate my sanctuary." Holmes stepped forward cautiously, his hand resting on the revolver in his coat pocket. "Dr. Victor Zemeckis, you are under arrest for the murders of Sir Reginald Whitmore, Henri Dubois, and undoubtedly several others. I advise you to surrender peacefully." Zemeckis finally turned to face us, and I was struck by the intensity of his gaze, the eyes of a man who had ventured so far into madness that he no longer recognized the boundary between reality and delusion. "Murder?" he laughed, the sound echoing strangely in the stone chamber. "Mr. Holmes, you understand nothing. Those men were not murdered. They were transformed, elevated to a higher plane of existence through participation in the Great Working. They died as mere collectors of dusty artifacts and were reborn as guardians of eternal wisdom. They died because you poisoned them with toxic vapors generated by your mechanical devices," Holmes replied calmly. "The only transformation involved was the conversion of living human beings into corpses for the sake of your megalomaniacal delusions." "Delusions?" Zemeckis' expression grew dangerously angry. "I have spent decades studying the genuine achievements of medieval alchemists, learning to reproduce effects that modern science dismisses as impossible. Tonight, when the astronomical alignment reaches its peak, I will demonstrate that the boundaries between science and magic are merely artificial constructs imposed by narrow-minded academics." He gestured toward the elaborate chemical apparatus surrounding the chamber. "These devices will release a gaseous compound of my own design into London's atmosphere, a substance that will enhance human perception, allowing thousands of people to experience directly the reality that lies beyond the veil of ordinary consciousness. They will see the ancient guardians that have always surrounded us, hear the cosmic harmonies that resonate through all existence, understand at last that the universe is far more wondrous and terrible than they ever imagined." Professor Thornton stepped forward, his face pale with horror. "Zemeckis, you're describing a massive chemical assault on innocent civilians. The compound you've described would cause mass hallucinations, panic, and quite possibly permanent psychological damage to thousands of people." "And what is the alternative?" Zemeckis snarled. "To allow humanity to continue in its state of willful ignorance, blind to the forces that shape reality, content with the limited perspective of material science? No, Professor. Tonight London will become the first city to transcend the boundaries of conventional existence, and I will be remembered as the man who opened the gateway to a new age of human consciousness." Holmes had been studying the chamber during this exchange, his keen eyes noting the positions of the various apparatus and calculating angles of approach. Suddenly, he spoke with commanding authority. "Lestrade, Lady Ashford, retreat to the tunnel immediately. Watson, Professor Thornton, take positions behind those stone pillars. Our friend Zemeckis has made a fatal error in his planning." "What error?" Zemeckis demanded, his hand moving toward a control panel beside the altar. Holmes smiled with cold satisfaction. "You have spent so much time studying medieval alchemy that you have forgotten the basic principles of modern chemistry. The electrical equipment you've installed in this chamber has been running for hours, building up significant static charges. The chemical vapors you've been generating are not only toxic, but highly flammable. One spark from your apparatus, and this entire chamber will explode like a bomb." Zemeckis' confident expression wavered as he glanced around at the chemical apparatus surrounding him. "Impossible. I have calculated every variable." "You have calculated nothing," Holmes interrupted. "You have simply assumed that your delusions of supernatural power would protect you from the mundane reality of cause and effect. Professor Thornton, activate the neutralizing agents now." The academic quickly opened several of the crates his assistants had carried, releasing clouds of white powder that immediately began reacting with the toxic vapors in the chamber. The chemical reaction produced a dramatic visual effect, streams of colored light dancing through the air as different compounds neutralized each other. Zemeckis stared at this display with obvious fascination, apparently convinced that his ritual was beginning to produce supernatural results. "Yes," he cried triumphantly, "the gateway opens. The ancient guardians respond to my summons." "The ancient guardians are molecules of silver nitrate reacting with chlorine gas," Holmes observed dryly. "Watson, can you safely approach the altar from that direction?" I studied the chamber layout and nodded. The neutralizing agents had cleared most of the toxic vapors, though the air still shimmered with residual chemical reactions. Moving carefully to avoid disturbing any of the electrical apparatus, I began working my way toward the altar where Zemeckis stood transfixed by what he believed to be supernatural phenomena. But as I approached, the true danger of our situation became clear. Zemeckis had not simply been preparing to release toxic vapors into London's atmosphere. He had been constructing an elaborate chemical bomb designed to disperse his compound across the greatest possible area. The altar at the center of the chamber was surrounded by dozens of pressurized containers connected to a timing mechanism that would detonate at precisely midnight. "Holmes!" I called out urgently. "The entire apparatus is rigged to explode in—" I checked the timer mechanism. "Less than 2 hours. If those containers rupture, the chemical release will be far more extensive than we anticipated." Holmes immediately grasped the implications. "Everyone out of the chamber immediately. Lestrade, evacuate a radius of at least half a mile from this location. Professor Thornton, can the timing mechanism be safely disabled?" The academic studied the apparatus briefly, then shook his head. "The wiring is too complex, and any attempt to interfere might trigger premature detonation. We need an explosives expert, and even then we must remove the containers before they can detonate," Holmes declared. "Watson, help me disconnect these pressure vessels from the central mechanism. If we can separate them from the electrical system, they should be safe to transport." Working with desperate urgency, we began the delicate process of dismantling Zemeckis's doomsday device. The madman himself seemed oblivious to our efforts, still convinced that the swirling chemical reactions around him represented the manifestation of supernatural forces. He stood at his altar, reading incantations from the stolen manuscripts, while colored flames danced around the chamber. "The transformation begins," he announced to no one in particular. "The barriers between worlds grow thin. Soon all of London will share in the cosmic revelation that I have achieved." "The only revelation here," Holmes muttered, as he carefully disconnected another pressure vessel, "is that brilliance without moral restraint inevitably leads to madness." As we worked, Lady Ashford surprised us all by moving to assist in the disconnection process, her familiarity with her late husband's collection allowing her to identify which artifacts were genuine antiques and which were Zemeckis's mechanical devices disguised as historical objects. "This dagger," she observed, examining one of the altarpieces, "is not the one from my husband's collection. The blade is hollow. It's designed to inject something into the air when the handle is depressed." "Another dispersal device," Professor Thornton confirmed after a brief examination. "Zemeckis has hidden chemical weapons throughout his display, disguised as ceremonial objects." The systematic dismantling of the chamber's deadly contents required nearly an hour of careful work, complicated by Zemeckis's increasingly erratic behavior as the neutralizing agents continued to clear the toxic vapors from the air. As his artificial euphoria faded, he began to realize that his great working was being systematically destroyed. "Stop!" he suddenly screamed, lunging toward Holmes with one of the genuine ceremonial daggers from his collection. "You cannot prevent the transformation. The ancient guardians demand their tribute." Holmes sidestepped the attack with practiced ease, using Zemeckis's own momentum to send him sprawling across the stone floor. The dagger clattered away into the shadows, and Lestrade immediately moved to secure the fallen madman with handcuffs. "Dr. Victor Zemeckis," the inspector announced formally, "you are under arrest for murder, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism against the citizens of London." As we finally emerged from the underground chambers, carrying the last of the dismantled chemical devices, I found myself marveling at the complexity of the scheme we had just thwarted. Zemeckis had spent years planning his great working, systematically acquiring the materials he needed through elaborate deceptions that had cost several innocent lives. "Holmes," I said as we watched Lestrade's men load the chemical apparatus into specially reinforced wagons for safe disposal, "how did you know that the electrical equipment would create explosive conditions?" My friend's smile held that familiar note of satisfaction that always accompanied the successful resolution of a challenging case. Elementary, my dear Watson. Zemeckis was brilliant in many ways, but his obsession with reproducing medieval alchemical practices blinded him to the dangers of combining ancient formulations with modern electrical equipment. He created the perfect conditions for a catastrophic explosion and then convinced himself that any resulting phenomena would be supernatural in origin. Professor Thornton joined our conversation, his expression still grave despite our success. Mr. Holmes, what troubles me most about this case is how easily Zemeckis was able to acquire the materials he needed for his scheme. The antiquities market is filled with dealers who ask no questions as long as payment is prompt, and the chemical supplies he required are readily available to anyone with academic credentials. A sobering reminder, Holmes agreed, that in our modern age, the tools of mass destruction are increasingly accessible to those with the knowledge to employ them. This case may be resolved, but I fear it will not be the last of its kind. As we made our way back through London's fog-shrouded streets, Lady Ashford walked beside me in contemplative silence. Finally she spoke, her voice barely audible above the clatter of horses' hooves on cobblestone. Dr. Watson, do you think my husband suspected what that manuscript really contained when he acquired it? Could he have known that his scholarly enthusiasm was being manipulated by someone like Zemeckis? It was a question that went to the heart of the entire affair. The ease with which genuine scholars could be deceived by those who exploited their intellectual curiosity for evil purposes. I believe your husband was exactly what he appeared to be, I replied gently. A dedicated collector, who was genuinely excited by the prospect of studying a rare historical document. Zemeckis preyed upon that excitement, using it to manipulate Sir Reginald into actions that he never would have taken if he had understood their true purpose. And yet the result remains the same. Good men are dead because they trusted someone who appeared to share their intellectual passions. Holmes, who had been listening to our conversation, turned to address Lady Ashford directly. Evil often disguises itself as knowledge, Lady Ashford, and those who seek truth are sometimes vulnerable to those who would exploit that seeking for their own ends. But the alternative, to cease seeking, to close our minds to new possibilities, would be a far greater tragedy than the individual deceptions we may encounter along the way. As we finally reached Baker Street and climbed the familiar stairs to our sitting room, I found myself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought us from a simple, locked-room mystery to the prevention of a chemical assault on London itself. Holmes had once again demonstrated his ability to see patterns and connections that eluded more conventional minds, but this case had required more than mere deduction. It had demanded an understanding of human nature in its most twisted and dangerous forms. The clock on our mantelpiece struck midnight as we settled into our chairs before the fireplace, the very hour when Zemeckis had planned to begin his great working. Instead of chemical-induced hallucinations spreading across London, we had the quiet satisfaction of another case successfully concluded and another dangerous criminal safely in custody. "Well, Watson," Holmes observed as he filled his pipe with tobacco, "what did you make of our adventure into the realm where science and superstition intersect?" "I found it deeply disturbing," I admitted. "Not because of any supernatural elements, as you demonstrated everything Zemeckis accomplished had entirely natural explanations, but because of how easily he was able to manipulate intelligent, educated people into serving his purposes." Indeed, the case serves as a reminder that intellectual brilliance, when divorced from moral restraint, can become one of the most dangerous forces in human society. Zemeckis possessed genuine scientific knowledge, but he used it to create elaborate deceptions, designed to satisfy his own megalomaniacal ambitions. Holmes paused to light his pipe, the familiar ritual apparently helping him organize his thoughts about the case. "What troubles me most, Watson, is the possibility that there may be others like Zemeckis, individuals who combine scientific knowledge with complete moral emptiness, who see their fellow human beings as mere subjects for experimentation rather than as people deserving of respect and protection. But surely such cases must be rare." "I hope so, my dear fellow. But as scientific knowledge becomes more widely available, and as the tools of destruction become more sophisticated, I fear we may see more criminals who combine intellectual brilliance with absolute ruthlessness. The Zemeckis case may be concluded, but the questions it raises about the intersection of knowledge and power will continue to challenge us for years to come. As the fire burned low in our grate, and the sounds of London gradually quieted into the peaceful rhythms of night, I found myself grateful once again for the partnership that had allowed us to prevent a catastrophe whose dimensions we could barely imagine. Holmes's unique combination of analytical brilliance and moral certainty had proved once again to be the perfect weapon against those who would use knowledge itself as an instrument of evil. The Whitmore House affair was closed, its mysteries solved and its dangers neutralized, but as I settled into sleep that night, I could not shake the feeling that our confrontation with Dr. Victor Zemeckis had provided us with a glimpse into a future where the very progress of human knowledge might create new forms of evil that would challenge even the greatest detectives to understand and defeat. Outside our window, London slept peacefully, unaware of how close it had come to experiencing horrors that would have transformed the greatest city in the world into a laboratory for one madman's twisted vision of human transformation. Thanks to Sherlock Holmes's brilliant deductions and our combined efforts, that nightmare had been prevented. But somewhere in the depths of my consciousness, I remained troubled by the knowledge that evil, like scientific progress itself, continues to evolve, and that future cases might require even greater courage and wisdom to resolve. The game would always be afoot, as Holmes so often observed, but this particular game had taught us that the stakes could be higher than we had ever imagined, and that the enemies we faced might wield weapons far more dangerous than mere bullets or blades. In the world that was coming, knowledge itself might become both our greatest tool and our most formidable adversary.